So welcome back to the last phase and a very important phase of our forum this afternoon. We are going to start talking to the attorney generals. And just for those of you who tuned in a little bit late, what we are going to do is we will have a 2-minute introduction by each of the candidates. Then we have 5 questions that have been carefully prepared for them, and they will have 2 minutes to answer each question. There will be no rebuttals. And then we'll have a 2-minute closing. We'd like to respectfully ask that you keep your chat in the chat box to a minimum. It is somewhat distracting to our candidates and to those watching. I know you all have your favorites out there, but as the creators of this forum, chairs Flora Lucero from Bernalillo County, Alex Pilad from Sandoval County or Rio Rancho area, the fastest growing in the country, she'll tell you, and our dear Pam Cordova, who is also our timer for the day. She will give you a 15-minute warning with a sign that says 15 seconds left, or not 15 minutes, 15 seconds. Yep, there you get. And then she'll say time in her school teacher voice, and you'll need to wrap it up. So those are the ground rules for the day. And I want a big shout out again to Valencia County for the 3 counties for hosting this and inviting me to join you all this afternoon. And so with that, I would like to go ahead and start with Mr. Colon, 2 minutes, opening statements.
Well, thank you so much. It is great to be back in front of so many wonderful Democrats. And let me just say that this is the way we win elections. We've got a great slate of candidates for the November general election in 2022. And the way we win is by working together. And that's exactly what we've done here at the county party level. And we are grateful for that. My name is Brian Colon. It has been a privilege to be your state auditor of New Mexico. And now I'm running to be your attorney general. Let me tell you, this race is personal to me. My story is the story of so many New Mexicans. Having grown up in Valencia County, thank you, Valencia County, for co-hosting today. I can tell you that I know what it is to grow up in poverty. I know what it is to be concerned about where your next meal is going to come from. So when I talk about today, when I talk about consumer protection, when I talk about community advocacy, for me, it comes from a personal lens. I'm a product of public schools. I went to New Mexico State University, UNM, very proudly for my undergraduate degree and my law degree 20 years ago. I will tell you that as your attorney general, my #1 priority is going to be holding bad actors accountable, whether they be child predators or sexual predators, violent, repeat criminal offenders, or making sure that we take illegal guns off of our streets. These are the priorities of the attorney general. I can tell you that I have been fighting for New Mexico families for my entire life. Whether it was when my father passed away and I fought for my mother and my brother and my sister for survival, or over my 20-year career representing individuals who'd been harmed, injured, mistreated, or misrepresented. That has been my career. Also, when I was chair of the Democratic Party of New Mexico, we embraced a platform for all. We embraced a platform that represented those who have been on the margins for far too long and without a voice. I want to take this fight to the New Mexico Attorney General's office and be your advocate to protect New Mexico's consumers and make sure that we hold big businesses and small businesses accountable and make sure that they're paying their fair share and taking care of New Mexicans. I'll work diligently to create a shared water rights plan for New Mexico to protect our environment and make sure that we aggressively litigate anybody who impedes upon our heritage, cultural, and agricultural history here in the land of enchantment. My name is Brian Colon. I look forward to the next 45 minutes with each and every one of you. Thank you for hosting.
Thank you, Mr. Colon. Mr. Torrez, please, opening statements.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I'm happy to be with so many extraordinary Democrats today. Before I talk about the issues that I think will define this race, I think as Democrats, we have to take a step back and focus on the state of our nation and what we have witnessed these last 5 years. There has been a steady erosion and attack on our democracy. The Supreme Court of the United States has undermined the Voting Rights Act and is on the cusp of rolling back the cherished rights of women to choose for themselves what they should do with their own bodies. Of course, we have so many things that we have to do in the Attorney General's office to safeguard the rights of every single New Mexican and every American in this country. And one of the things that I think is really going to come out in sort of making the choice between Mr. Colon and myself is where we come from. I'm a prosecutor. I'm not a politician. I'm not somebody who has tended to the political. I came to public office later in life. But what I have done is dedicated my professional life, my adult life, to serving New Mexicans, to fighting for families, to seeking justice. I started off as a frontline prosecutor in Valencia County. I worked for Gary King and Patricia Madrid. I was named by President Obama to be a White House fellow and served in the Obama administration in the Justice Department, where I fought to protect the safety and rights and security of women in Indian country. I came back to New Mexico and served as a frontline prosecutor, where I've handled every single type of criminal case, both in the state system and the federal system. And after that, I sought the office of the district attorney here in Bernalillo County. I run the largest law office in the state. It is a huge challenge. We have so much to do. But again, I think we need to be focused on who has dedicated themselves to the law, to the practice of law. And I urge you to take seriously what we want from the next Attorney General. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Torrez. And as such, the first question will go to you, Mr. Torrez. And this question is, what is your highest priority for criminal prosecutions in the state? There are many types of crime. What type of prosecutions would be in the best interest of the AG's office to pursue?
Well, having worked as a special prosecutor inside the AG's office and now leading the district attorney's office, I understand the role between what the DAs need to cover and what the attorney general is uniquely positioned to do. I think the most important thing we need to focus on in the attorney general's office is the establishment of a special unit, which we've actually established in the Bernalillo County DA's office, that's focused on missing and murdered Indigenous women. For far too long, the epidemic of violence that has ravaged those communities and left too many families harmed by violence and predatory behavior and human trafficking is something that needs to be tackled at the statewide level. We need to break down the barriers of communication and the siloed information that keeps tribal law enforcement, state law enforcement, and federal law enforcement from collaborating and working together effectively. That's something that I'm proud that we've initiated in the Bernalillo County DA's office, but it needs to be expanded upon. It needs to be built upon. We have 2 dedicated analysts right now. We're hiring investigators, but this is a problem that has gone on too long. We have ignored the plight of women in Indian country, and it is the unique role of the Attorney General to step in and fill the void.
Thank you, Mr. Colon. The same question. What is your highest priority for criminal prosecutions in the state? There are many types of crime. What type of prosecutions would be in the best interest of the AG's office to pursue?
Well, for me, I'm glad. Thank you, Mr. Torres, for that answer. I'll just say that I think it's good that he has followed the Attorney General's announcement about that work for missing and murdered Indigenous women. I couldn't agree more that that's an issue that's important. But for me, it's personal, and I think it's about children. It's about protecting our children. This is not a prosecutorial office. There are 9 prosecutors in the Attorney General's office. This office is a lot more about protecting families at a policy level. What Mr. Torres may call a politician, I would say these people that have served in the party, whether it's as a former state party chair or as state auditor, we have advanced the policies that have given public officials the platform to do the work they do. And so I'm proud to have done that. And let me be clear, I'm grateful to all the folks on here that may also be considered politicians for doing the work they do to advance our platform at the Democratic Party level. So for me, it's going to be about making sure that when other district attorneys take a walk on cases, whether it's prosecuting police who overstep on their use of force continuum, whether they are overstepping their boundaries, the Attorney General's office is willing to review those cases and prosecute where appropriate. I can tell you that doesn't happen at every district attorney's office, and unfortunately it doesn't happen frequently enough. So for me, it's about making sure that we're aggressively protecting our children and their families, and then also holding those who abuse their power accountable every step of the way.
Thank you. Second question, we will start with Mr. Colon. What is your highest priority for the civil work that the Attorney General does. That is for consumer justice, environmental justice, civil rights, representing the state's boards and commissions.
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for really highlighting the gravity and the breadth of the office. And I've done a lot of work in different sections in the areas of civil work, and that's been my work for 20 years, has been in civil law. And my highest priority right now, it's about protecting our heritage, our culture, and our agricultural history. And that means protecting our water and our environment. At the end of the day, we know that we've got the Texas v. New Mexico litigation that's been ongoing for quite some time. It's cost taxpayers millions of dollars. We will continue to aggressively litigate those claims and make sure that Texas does not get our water. But at the end of the day, we have to have a comprehensive water plan that serves all stakeholders. We cannot litigate our way forward on this. It will be far too expensive for New Mexico's taxpayers. I've got a long history and track record of bringing people together to come up with common sense and appropriate solutions forward to protect New Mexicans. That's what I intend to do when it comes to that civil litigation. And at the end of the day, we know that our future is going to be based on the quality of our environment. It's protecting our community for generations to come. It's knowing what it is to grow up in rural New Mexico. It's knowing what it is to be engaged in rural New Mexico, whether it was when I was working with the Southern New Mexico community with a state fair and all our farmers and ranchers in Southern New Mexico, where we have one of our largest export items, our crops, our pecans. And I'll just tell you, we've got to make sure and protect that history, our cultura, our herencia, our gente. That's what this is about for me. It's about making sure that we bring leadership to the office. We can't just do this with prosecution. You've got to have a broad lens and you got to bring leadership to the office. That's what I've done at the Office of the State Auditor. It's what I'll do as your Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Colon. Mr. Torres, what is your highest priority for the civil work the Attorney General does? That is for consumer justice, environmental justice, civil rights, representing the state's boards and commissions.
Well, I think Mr. Colon is right to highlight the need to protect our water resources for future generations. My family's from Southern New Mexico. We've been part of Acequia for a very long time, and this is the lifeblood of those communities. But what I will say is that I'm deeply concerned about the way in which the litigation in that particular case has been pursued. We have counsel for certain aspects of that litigation that had no appellate experience, no natural resources experience, and I'm not entirely sure what qualifications that they've had. So one of the first things I think we need to do is build the internal capacity of the Attorney General's office to actually litigate those cases by people and attorneys who are employed by and for the state of New Mexico. Far too often, we seem to be outsourcing a lot of that litigation rather than building the capacity of our own local attorneys and experts that I think can really form the core of a tremendous litigation unit. We have to be aggressive, we have to be assertive, and we have to look out over the horizon, think about climate change, and think about the types of impacts that we are going to see as a community in the Southwest where access to water, and clean air is extraordinarily important. But it starts by building the resources of the office itself. We've neglected that for far too long. We've outsourced it to too many people who don't know what they're doing. And this is the kind of hard choice that I think the next Attorney General is going to have to make is how are we picking the representatives? How are we picking these advocates and these law firms that are going to be representing the state of New Mexico? Do they serve us or do they serve their own interests? I think that's a critical question and one that I hope to highlight in the coming campaign.
Thank you, Mr. Torres. Next question, we will start with Mr. Torres. And this is because New Mexico is both a border state and home to families with mixed citizenship status, immigration policy matters a lot in this state. What commitment do you have to keeping New Mexico families intact, even if federal policy changes during your term?
Well, this is another example of what we were talking about the unique role that New Mexico has in shaping the national narrative, about declaring unequivocally what our values are in holding families together. Family separation and the policy of the Trump administration was an absolute abomination. It should never be allowed to be repeated in this state or in any state in this nation. That's why we have to state unequivocally our opposition to those kinds of draconian policies. And we have to be forceful in taking the lead, not just following other jurisdictions, not just allowing, for example, California or New York or Illinois or other jurisdictions to take the lead in opposing family separation. Families were separated on the border here in New Mexico, and we need to be vigilant. We also need to be vigilant about the rising militancy of the militia groups that are also going down to the border, continuing to be encouraged to engage in enforcement when they shouldn't. I have a track record as the only district attorney in the entire country who has filed an affirmative action against an organized militia group. And that militia group is on notice, as are every other militia group in this state. We will not rest, and we will not refrain from protecting New Mexicans and keeping families together.
Thank you, Mr. Torres. Mr. Colon, same question. Because New Mexico is both a border state and home to families with mixed citizenship status, immigration policy matters a lot in this state. What commitment do you have to keeping New Mexico families intact, even if federal policy changes during your term?
Well, I think it's important to understand that it's most important to keep those families intact if federal policy changes. I've got a long track record and history of advocating for those exact families. For me, it's personal, as often these matters are. I'll tell you, my wife's an immigrant from a third world country. She came here. She's done a phenomenal job, not just building a life for herself, but building my life and being my number one advocate and allowing me to be from where I was to where I am today, thanks to her 25 years by my side. I'll just say that because of my role in the community, because of my advocacy, my political engagement, and it being a public office holder for the last 4 years, I have the privilege of pouring into young people and families who are in need, who reach out to me when they're at their lowest points. And whether they're DACA students who are scared because the federal policy has changed and they find themselves in the shadows again, or whether they're someone who I'm mentoring who's in law school, who we're going to advocate so that the Supreme Court admits them to be the very first undocumented individual in New Mexico to become a practicing attorney. That was my mentee. I'm so proud of her. And we'll continue to advocate for those families because we know in New Mexico, probably better than anywhere else, that those are the families that enrich us the most. They're the ones that give this community texture. They're the ones that bring us the beauty of what we are here, which is a multicultural state. And we got to respect that heritage, that history, and those people. We've got so many families that have been coming to the United States as refugees and as immigrants, and it happened long before the last few presidents. It's been happening for generations after generations. For me, it's part of my story, and it's who I'll be advocating for, those exact families.
Thank you, Mr. Colon. Next question, you will begin again, Mr. Colon. If you could influence federal immigration policy, what would you recommend?
Sure. First of all, I think that we need to lead in this policy. We need to come from a place of understanding and centering the stories of those who we are dealing with. Unfortunately, the people in power are the ones governing from the powerful position down to these individuals who are the subject of those regulations. What we really ought to be doing is centering their stories and helping the public understand the plight of a refugee, the plight of an immigrant, the plight of a family living in the shadows who's often even fearful to report crimes to our government officials in positions of power. Once you center those stories, once I've had the conversations with people in our community, people around our state, even in Eastern New Mexico, I have conversations about families and specific individuals, and I center their stories and say, our public policies have to be policies that are humane, policies that embrace those who come to New Mexico, whether it be for refugee asylum or whether it be for immigration. These are families that are no different than our own. They're here trying to make a better life for themselves and for generations to come. So for me, I think if I could influence the federal government in terms of the way they're having this conversation, we got to be telling our story. We got to be telling our story about how impactful immigrants have been to New Mexico. This is a state that's flown under 3 different flags. We've got a long and rich history of immigration in New Mexico. And I want to help tell that story and influence immigration policy at the federal level in a very important way. And look, if the federal government's going to continue to get it wrong, we'll continue to push them to get it right. We won't be afraid to litigate. We won't be afraid to be part of that public conversation. The attorney generals, coast to coast, have the opportunity to influence that type of legislation every single day. We are blessed in that we have a strong federal delegation. We have two amazing United States senators. We have some great members of Congress that are willing to help us advance this conversation. I look forward to standing shoulder to shoulder with each of them to get from where we are to where we need to be on that federal policy.
Thank you, Mr. Colon. Same question to you, Mr. Torres. If you could influence federal immigration policy, what would you recommend?
Well, the first thing I think we need to re-examine are the frameworks and treaties we've established for international trade. A lot of some folks may not understand or know this about my background. I actually studied economics before I came to the law, and part of what you saw in the aftermath of NAFTA was just a devastation of the agricultural core of the Mexican countryside and the campesinos who could no longer access national markets in the way that they could. They couldn't compete with, with the United States in terms of trade, and it devastated their economy, and it created a lot of push for folks who were looking for work. But more recently, there's been a fragmentation and a disintegration in Central American countries who have experienced extraordinary violence, gang violence in particular. As a former federal prosecutor, one of the things that we used to see was the flight that would come from people who were seeking a better life and just safety for their family. Women who have been threatened, who have been sexually assaulted, they're scared of having their children trafficked, and they are fleeing from violence. And so if you want to try and address what's happening at the border, if we are a humane society, if we are a big-hearted society, we need to take ownership over American policies that have driven immigration and have not helped poor people and working people in those countries. But we also need to think about what kinds of investments we can make in Central American countries who have just been devastated by political corruption and gang violence. And we have a role to play. This country has extraordinary resources, but it doesn't really understand the kind of impact that its policies have had on other countries. And to a certain extent, our failure in foreign policy is driving that flow of immigration. We have a moral responsibility to attack it, and I think we should.
Thank you, Mr. Torres. And this question will go to you first, Mr. Torres, this next question. How would you and your office involve itself in New Mexico's environmental future? For example, converting to sustainable energy resources, sharing water with Texas, dealing with emissions and toxic spills?
Well, thank you for the question. I think the most important thing that we need to do is actually recruit and train and build the capacity of the Attorney General's office to engage in that litigation for itself. Right now, we have an unfortunate dependency where we continue to ask and wait for outside counsel to come in and make bids about spills, about pollution, about other types of issues. And I'm not entirely sure how that selection process is going, but what I can tell you is this: we have extraordinary talent in this state. We have extraordinary attorneys. We have some of the best natural resource attorneys in the country. We just don't have them right now inside the Attorney General's office because we haven't made a concerted effort to build that capacity. And we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't have to rely exclusively on big out-of-state law firms to provide the legal firepower to defend our families, to protect our children from harm, to make sure that we have clean air and clean water. And I am glad that the governor and the legislature have taken the lead in trying to move us towards a carbon-free power generation state. I think that's an extraordinary step in the right direction. But we have unchecked methane wells, or wells that are leaking methane, all over this state from wildcat drilling operations. And we don't have a comprehensive plan for going after those individuals. And we haven't done enough litigation to make sure that the people who are responsible for that pollution are held accountable, that they take the profits from those companies who have endangered the communities and the quality of life and the environment around the state. They should be made to pay for the damage that they have done to this environment. And they should be responsible for making sure that our families and our children are safe.
Thank you, Mr. Torres. Mr. Colon, same question. How would you and your office involve itself in New Mexico's environmental future? For example, converting to sustainable energy resources, sharing water with Texas, dealing with emissions and toxic spills.
Excellent question. And this is something I've been working on for 20 years. I will tell you that you go back 20 years ago, and I got to sit down with leaders in a small community in northern New Mexico up on the Enchanted Circle, Cuesta, New Mexico. And it was the only designated Superfund site here in New Mexico, and it was being reclamated by, the community was really harmed by some of the mining that had been done up there by the Molycorp Corporation, which successors ultimately became Chevron Corporation. And we worked to hold those corporations accountable to help rebuild that community as it had taken those extracted minerals out of that community and left it at the end of the day without jobs and with a big pit. And we worked with the federal government and we worked with that community to make sure that those conversations were in the best interest of the people of Cuesta. They're in Condado de Taos. And I can tell you from that moment on, I realized what it was when big businesses came into communities and extracted minerals and did mining in communities and did it for their private benefit. At the end of the day, ultimately they left and the communities were left holding the bag. And so again, these are stories that I've heard my entire career, not because I've been in the criminal system, but because I have been representing individuals and communities for my 20 years in practice. And now as the state auditor of New Mexico, sitting with these communities, learning what their needs are and trying to find a way to help them get really compensated for what's been done to their communities. I couldn't agree more with Mr. Torres. When it comes to uncapped wells, there's got to be accountability. We've been talking about this for a long time. You're going to talk about methane. You're going to talk about drip when you're talking about oil extraction and these folks who are pulling the oil out of the ground and not paying for the drip. That affects our schools. It affects our classrooms, the resources that our land commissioner has to allocate and to provide for our children. For me, it's always about accountability and making sure that we hold folks accountable, and I'll be able to do that as your Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Colon. Gosh, the time has gone by so quickly, and you have answered some very tough, sticky wicket questions, and we appreciate it. And now it is time for closing comments. Mr. Colon, you will go first with 2 minutes.
Well, again, thank you to everybody. Thanks to the stakeholders. Thanks to the nearly 120 folks that have joined us today. It is a pleasure to be engaged with the Democratic Party of New Mexico and our county leaders. These platforms matter. Your work matters. When we talk about coming in November and we have the strongest ticket we've seen in decades, it's going to be because of your work in your community. So let me be very clear. I appreciate you. I value you. And I appreciate every politician that steps up and says, I'm willing to serve New Mexico. That's what I've done. I hope I've made you proud with my work as the state auditor, where we've done the hard work. We've held folks accountable, whether they've been Democrats or Republicans. We did the right thing. Whether it was a Democratic mayor in Las Vegas, New Mexico, who is abusing power, she's no longer mayor. She's now a convicted felon because we worked with the Attorney General's office on that prosecution. Whether it's holding Coy Griffin and Cowboys for Trump accountable in Otero County, that was easy. It was a little more difficult when I had to go into my home community when the school board in Los Lunas was abusing its power. But we held both accountable because we've done the right thing in the Office of the Attorney General every day. Look, everybody wants to talk about the revolving door, talking about being hard on crime. What I want to talk about in this race for Attorney General over the next 4 months is going to be about how do we stop people from walking in the door the first time? How do we make sure that we have a behavioral health and mental health system that helps take people out of the system before they even get in? That's what we need to be talking about as community. If we want to talk about the humanity of how we embrace our immigration policy, then we better well be talking about how we also talk about that as it relates to criminal justice. We know for far too long we've had an overrepresentation of people who live in poverty, not poor people, but people who live in poverty. There's a difference. Words matter. And I will tell you how we talk about them and how we provide support systems and structural change so that they can avoid being in the system in the first place matters. As Attorney General, I want to set the table so those stakeholders have a voice. I want to give power to those who've been on the margins and for far too long have been invisible. My name is Brian Colon. It's an honor to serve as a constitutional statewide officer of New Mexico. It's been an honor to serve as your chair of the Democratic Party in the past. I'm grateful to every one of you, and I hope to get your vote for Attorney General of New Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Colon. And Mr. Torres, last but not least, your turn for closing comments, please.
Well, I want to thank Brian for being here. I want to thank you for giving us both the opportunity. Uh, Look, I was born and raised right here in Albuquerque. I'm raising children here. My parents are here, and I have spent the last 17 years of my life fighting for New Mexico's families, fighting for justice. As I said at the beginning, I am a prosecutor. I am not someone who has spent my life focused on politics. I have been focused on the courtroom. I have been dedicated to gaining the kind of experience that we need. I lead right now one of the largest law offices in the entire state, and it has extraordinary challenges. But we've made extraordinary progress clearing the rape kit backlog. My office is the first office in the entire state to use forensic genealogy to solve cold case rape cases. My office is the first in the state to establish a unit for missing and murdered Indigenous women. My office is the first in the entire country to name officers who have identified integrity issues so that they won't participate in our criminal justice system and they won't move on to smaller communities. My office is the only office in the nation that has filed an action against the right-wing organized militia movement. And you better believe that each of these issues is going to determine what kind of future we have for my children and for the children that are being raised all over this incredible state. There is so much at stake right now, from the attacks on our democracy, the inclusion of every single American and New Mexican so that they can vote, so they can participate in our society. We have fought for too long and for too hard to make sure that this is an inclusive society, that everyone is deserving of respect and a voice at the table. And believe it or not, the fights aren't just going to happen in Congress. They're not just going to happen in the legislature. They're going to happen in the courtroom. And for that, you need a real experienced attorney. That's what I am, and that's what I'll bring to the Attorney General's office. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Torres and Mr. Colon. It has been an honor and a privilege to moderate. Thank you to Bernalillo County Flora Lucero, Alex Peland, and Pam Cordova, respectively Sandoval County Chair and Valencia County Chair. I turn